when you get into the seeds of cancel culture and woke ideology and DEI and how it's fundamentally corrupted universities and specifically law schools within universities, and that is the theme of the book, I think. What are the roots? Like, because when Don Lemon said that to me, I thought we were going to have like immediate consensus and agreement, and I suddenly realized, oh, something's fundamentally different. Like, when did that happen?
So that's the ideological piece, which is important, certainly. And to be clear, what you just put your finger on, and the theme running through my book is that this is not the decades-old conservative lament about hippies taking over the faculty lounge at Berkeley. In fact, those Berkeley hippies, the free speech movement and all, would be considered retrograde by these postmodern left-wing critical theory activists and what have you, because the idea of free speech, that's an aspect of white supremacy or white what have you. Much like due process and equal protection, all of these classical liberal values, the basis for everything from, higher education institutions, truth-seeking, open inquiry, to the ACLU or civil libertarian organizations, all of that according to this whether you call it postmodern or whatever, but the theory is all existing institutions, because they're imbued with irrevocably these racist, sexist, other illegitimate structures, need to be blown up and then rebuilt in a year zero French Revolution style to reflect intersectional matrices and privilege hierarchies, and so your rights and your freedoms depend on where you are in the privilege structure and so forth. It's really bizarre, but it's also, once it began to be taken seriously, frightful. And it's fairly recent that it began to be taken seriously, because when I was in college in the late 90s and law school in the early 2000s, I'd heard about the crits, right? Critical theory, critical legal studies. But that was some remnant, some niche thing from the 80s, early 90s that had been relegated to sociology departments or what have you. It wasn't really a thing that we concerned ourselves with. Even my colleagues who were on the left, they weren't, either trying to mollify or push back their excesses. No, it just wasn't a thing. But then maybe 10 or 15 years later, certainly 2014, which is also an inflection point for Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, the coddling of the American mind, social media explosion, addling brains, all these sorts of things. We have the reintroduction of critical theory, which, as I call it in one of my chapters, it returned with a vengeance. And that really subverts higher education, this pursuit of open inquiry and development of human knowledge, but especially law schools, legal education, because if you don't believe in objective truth, if you don't believe in due process, equality under the law, free speech, everyone just should be treated equally by a neutral arbiter. If forget constitutional law or civil rights, if property law, contracts, securities, all of that is illegitimate, well, then what are we even doing here? And so it's really scary, because not because lawyers are special in some normative way, moral way, but law schools turn out, especially elite law schools, turn out the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions.
Yeah, like it or not, we need lawyers not to be bad.
That's a good way of putting it.
I don't know what Shakespeare would think about that.
Well, that's the other. Well, that's kind of a classic misunderstanding of he put that line, the first thing we do is kill all the lawyers, in the mouth of a bad guy. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that he was actually arguing that or even making like a lawyer joke, as we would now call it. He would say, of course, that's the bad guy. He would argue for that. Yeah. And in fact, the epigram for my book, Lawless, the Miseducation of America's Elites, is from the movie A Man for All Seasons, Robert Bolt, right? If the devil cuts down, yes, I'd be in favor of cutting down all the laws just to get to the devil. Well, Roper, what if, all the laws in England are cut down and the devil turns around on you? Where are you then?
Yeah. So I want to get back to sort of the institutional corruptions and what's going on at the American Bar Association and what's going on in corporate law offices and all that stuff. You write about all this stuff, but obviously the writing of this book was cathartic for you, because you were in fact a victim of this entire cancel culture infrastructure after the last time we talked, and I want you to tell that story and explain. Explain what happened, but also sort of the the feckless bureaucracy
Yeah.
that just dragged you through the mud.
Yeah, and we'll get to the bureaucracy. That's an important theme. Everyone looks at the ideological part because that's sexy and in the news, but the bureaucracy is a huge aspect of this illiberal takeover. Right. So I had been at Cato for almost 15 years, and that's when my last book came out, and wasn't necessarily looking to leave, but this opportunity presented itself from Randy Barnett, who I'm sure you know.
He's been on the show several times.
There you go.
Yeah.
I've known
Great
him for a long time.
constitutional scholar, kind of a rock star in the
godfather of the constitutional challenge to Obamacare, which is when I really got to know him personally, because we worked together a lot on developing that theory. And we won on the Commerce Clause and Necessary and Proper Clause. I don't know who was in charge of the taxing power and coaxing Chief Justice Roberts, but anyway, that's a story for another time. So we were having dinner one night in, I guess it would have been October of 21, and he decides to offer me a job to direct his center at Georgetown, the Center for the Constitution, which, as we've learned, is an important center because the rest of the law school is the center against the Constitution. And he spends a lot of time in Florida these days, so it's good to have someone on the ground running these things. And I would have an inward-looking focus in terms of teaching and programs at Georgetown, as well as outward proselytizing originalism in media and writing articles. And so it's a different sort of way to impact the world of ideas that I'd been doing in my career. So fast forward a couple of months, about 4 days before I was due to start my job. This was late January of 2022 at this point. Justice Breyer announces his retirement. And, judicial politics, nominations, Supreme Court, that was the subject of my last book. That's my bread and butter. So I was doing a lot of media that day. I happened to be in Austin, Texas. So that night I got to my hotel room. If I had been home, none of this probably would have happened. But, I had nothing to do. I was doom scrolling Twitter late at night in my hotel room before going to bed. As we do. Not a good practice. Not a good practice. And the upshot of all of my commentary and analysis of that day of, who's going to succeed Breyer, what's Biden going to do, I was getting more and more upset that Joe Biden did indeed hew to his campaign promise to appoint a black woman. And I thought, well, there's nothing wrong with a black woman, but, why don't we just get the best candidate? And so I thought, well, if I were a Democratic progressive president, whom would I appoint? And I thought the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, the second most powerful court in the country, happens to be an Indian-American immigrant. His name is Sri Srinivasan, excellent judge. Got all his progressive bona fides, but not quite all of the intersectional bona fides. And so I tweeted this out, and I said, and therefore, because he's disqualified for these, improper reasons, intersectional reasons, we are going to end up with a, quote, lesser black woman. And it's that inartful phrasing, which I admitted, the next day. I was like, who among us has not phrased a bad tweet at some point? And I thought, okay, well, that could have been phrased better, and I apologized for doing that. But it is willful misreading and malicious misunderstanding of what I was saying to suggest that I was saying that no black woman could ever be qualified for the court, or all black women are lesser humans, or something like that. Just a ridiculous kind of perception, but that's what my ideological enemies on Twitter and in the academy ran with to try to stop me from taking.
You had one particular guy that loved to troll you that sort of started the fight.
He's a Georgetown alum. He's Slate's legal correspondent, Mark Joseph Stern, and everything that happened to me, I wouldn't wish on anyone other than him. Mm-hmm. It was, surreal in very many ways. Over this tweet, I felt like my career was completely crumbling. Everything I'd worked towards for decades, the sacrifices of my parents in taking me out of the Soviet Union and scrimping and saving, and the immigrant's journey and all of that, all the hard work. My family. I had 2 little kids. I now have 4. We ended up having twins during that cancellation year. Our cancellation babies. They're now 2. My professional life was flashing before my eyes over a tweet where clearly I was, it was again, just god awful. I called it the 4 days of hell, until Bill Traynor of Georgetown, decided that I wouldn't be fired on the spot or my contract rescinded. Nor would he vindicate my free speech rights or something like that while saying, I disagree, but no, nothing like that. Instead, it was a very kind of hand-wringing, mealy-mouthed, very deanly result of punting this to the DEI office and the HR office to investigate me. What is there to investigate? Very short tweet, very short policy, whether you're talking about free expression or harassment, discrimination. But this so-called investigation ended up lasting 4 months. So it was 4 days of hell followed by 4 months of purgatory and farce, at the end of which somebody at the high-paid law firm that Georgetown hired to advise them on this, Wilmer Hale, looked at a calendar and realized, he wasn't yet an employee when he tweeted, so he's not even subject to these policies. So I was not quite vindicated, but I was reinstated on that technicality.
How many hours did they bill to come to that conclusion?
I am guessing that they spent probably $1 million.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
Yeah. So take a quick step back and just point out that Georgetown at one point had sort of I think I'm getting this right, sort of a gold standard free speech standard. Most universities,
their policy on paper or on pixels is excellent, due in part to the excellent work of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Most speech codes around the country are gone, and we have speech protective, kind of First Amendment aligned policies, but they're observed in the breach, and there's a failure of enforcement, to be sure.
Yeah. So, and that gets back to, so we've touched on the ideology. I want to get into the bureaucracy.
Let me conclude the story,
Sure.
because I'm not now at Georgetown, and in fact, once I was reinstated on that technical victory, I celebrated that. But then I got the fine print. I got the 10-page report from the DEI office, which at Georgetown is called the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA. And this report, it was clear that it had been lawyered by the outside lawyers, because it was all ready to convict me and fire me and castrate me and all the rest of it. But ultimately, because of this technical resolution, they didn't have a conclusion. But what it did say was, if I ever said or wrote anything that caused similar offense, then I would be creating a hostile educational environment. Never mind what the free expression policy says. And I realized, with advice of counsel and Randy Barnett and my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us, that this was untenable. I could not do the job that I was hired to do. And so I decided, I realized I needed to resign. And as one does, I published my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal, and then announced my next move to the Manhattan Institute, which I had organized over the course of that weekend. They were very gracious, and I'm grateful to Raihan Salan for putting all that together. I've known him for a while, and now he's the dynamic president of MI. Put that together for me, and so when I announced my resignation, I was able to announce my move on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox, again, as one does, and then start controlling the media narrative and using this platform I've been given to shine the light on the rot in academia.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.